So now we get started with refs, reactive, and with functions which replace methods. What about computed properties? How can we replace those? Again, let's expand our example here a little bit. Let's say we actually don't just have the change age button, but we have a div below that, below the change age button, and in there we have two inputs. The first input here is for the first name. The second input is for the last name. And I want to use the values entered here to output my username, which should be combined from first and last name. Now let's see how we can implement this. First of all, I will add two refs here. I will add a first name ref, which initially is an empty string, and a last name ref, which also is empty initially. Of course, you could have different default values, but I will start with empty strings. Now I want to update the first name whenever we type into this input, and the last name whenever we type into this input. We'll have a look at two-way binding and vmodel in a second. For the moment, I'll do it manually by listening to @input. So by listening to the input event. Now I want to trigger some code whenever this event occurs, and therefore I'll actually add a new function, set first name, where I get the default event object, and where I then want to set first name dot value, so the value of the first name ref, equal to event target value. And do the same for the last name, set last name, getting the event, and setting last name dot value equal to event target value. Now we can expose these two functions through this object to the template. Set first name points at set first name. And here I use the same name for the key as I do for the variable that holds the function. And hence we can use the modern JavaScript shorthand to just use this name once, and this will automatically be expanded to this longer syntax by JavaScript. This simply saves us some code which we don't have to type. And the same for set last name. So now these functions, set first name and set last name, are exposed under these identifiers to the template. So we can bind them. Here on the first input, I'll point at set first name. On the second one, I'll point at set last name. And calling these functions works just as you learned it. You can call them manually, you can forward the event object manually then, or you just point at them and let Vue execute those functions for you, passing on the default event object for you when these events occur. So regarding event listening and how you call functions, nothing changed. But now we got these two inputs in place, and we're updating first name and last name with every keystroke. Now I don't really need uname anymore. Instead, now I want to have a computed username which is based on the first and the last name, and which therefore should update whenever first and last name changes. Now, as you might guess, we're not going to do this by adding the computed option. This is as we would have done it in the past, but this is not how we'll do it anymore. Instead, again, we'll write more code here in the setup method. But which code? Well, there is another function we can import from the Vue framework, and that is the computed function. And it already gives us a clear hint at what it will do. You call computed in your setup function, and then computed wants a function as an argument. It's the function that holds your computed logic. So basically what you had in a computed property before as well. Computed properties with the options API were methods where you returned the computed value. And we're doing the same here in this function, which we pass to the computed call. Here we return our computed value. So for example, first name plus a blank plus last name. And not this first name, because we're not referring to a property. I'm just referring to this first name ref here and to this last name ref. Well, and actually, since I'm referring to refs, we should use .value because you learned a ref is an object with a value property, and the actual value which is managed is stored in that value property. Which is also why we're setting the value property here in setFirst and setLastName. You're only allowed to omit the value property if you use this ref in the template. If you use it anywhere in JavaScript code and you want to read or write to the value, then you have to access .value. But with that, we return this value as a computed property, and this computed function simply makes sure that this function we pass to it is re-executed whenever one of the dependencies, so in this case, whenever first name or last name changes. And the Vue will automatically dive into this function and keep track of all the dependencies specified there. It will see that you're using first name and last name here, and therefore it will automatically keep track of those refs and update the computed property whenever one of the two refs changes. Now, of course, computing a value is nice, but only useful if we save it somewhere. So here I'll have my uname. I commented out the old uname, so now I have my new uname, which is a computed property. And a computed property under the hood is also just a ref. So on uname you can access a value, but, and that's important, but it is a ref which is read-only. Normal refs, like first name and last name and age, are read and write. We can set new values as we're doing it in various places. Computed properties, computed refs, are read-only. Setting value, like I'm doing it here, is not something you should do, is not something that's allowed. Reading is okay though. And with that, we return our username still pointing at uname, which now is this new computed ref. And with that, username should be output here, and it should be updated whenever we type into those inputs. So if we save this, you initially see no name up there, but if I start typing, you see that name getting longer and longer. And that is because we're using a computed property, a computed ref, which we expose to the template, which we update by updating our first and last name refs. So that's how we can use computed. Let me come back to those inputs. I mentioned that event listening works just as before. You can call those methods as you need to. You can forward the default event argument. It's forwarded automatically if you just point at the method. And you can forward any other arguments your methods might need. But you can also use other core Vue features with the Composition API. For example, vModel to add two-way binding in case you wanted this here. So instead of manually listening to the input event and calling our functions here, which of course works and is fine, but instead of just doing that, you can also use vModel. And here's the cool thing, vModel also accepts refs and reactive values. So here I can just bind first name, and here I just bind last name. And Vue will automatically detect that these are refs, and it will update the value properties whenever you type into those fields. So you don't bind .value. Instead, as mentioned before, in the template, when working with a ref, you always just use the ref like this without drilling into the value property. Vue will do this for you behind the scenes. So with that, we're binding first name and last name here, but if we save that, we'll see that it won't work. If I reload, I'm getting a warning already, and if I type here, we see no update on the screen. And the warning is that property last name was accessed during render, but is not defined. Wait, what? It is defined here. Well, it's defined in setup, and we're using it in template, but one thing is missing. We're not exposing it to the template. Whatever you want to use in a template needs to be part of that object you return at the end of setup. And here we're not returning first and last name. We are returning our old update functions, but we're actually not using those anymore, so we can't even delete them. Instead, we should now expose first name and point at our first name ref, or use the shorthand if we use the same key name as we have for the variable name, and expose last name. So we need to expose those two refs under any names of our choice, for example, under the same names, so that we can access them here. And now with that, if we save this and reload, the warning is gone. And now you see two-way binding works just as before with refs here. So now let's have a look at the last option we want to replace, and that's the watch option. Watch can be useful for running some code, like sending a behind-the-scenes HTTP request when some data changes. Of course, I don't want to send a HTTP request in this simple app here, but I still want to show you how watch works. Normally, you add your watch option here, which was this object, and in there you could then watch age by adding a method of the same name. So watch this age property by adding such a method. You would get the new value whenever watch triggers, and then you could console log val here, for example. That's what you could do with watch. Well, obviously, that's not what we're doing now. Instead, we import a new thing from Vue, and that thing is another function, the watch function. The watch function is also part of the composition API, and the watch function allows us to register a watcher inside of this setup method. And yes, it's quite normal that you have a lot of things in this setup method, as you can tell already. So in here, let's say here, for example, after we defined our refs, we can call watch. And now watch wants two arguments here. The first argument is a dependency of watch, telling watch when it should execute the watcher function. And for example here, we could pass the ref. So this ref is now a dependency of watch. The second argument is the actual function that should be called then. Now we need to specify this dependency because with the options API, the dependency was just the name of the watch method. Now it's just watch as a function, so to still let watch know when the watcher function should run, we need to specify the dependency first. So that's and then whenever changes, this function is executed. In this function, we now actually get two arguments automatically by watch, and that's the new value and the old value. So we get the value of before it changed and then after the change. And here we can console log old age plus old value, and then also console log new age plus new value, like this. And that's all. If we now save this and reload, nothing is printed here, as you can tell. But if I now click change age, which changes the age, we see old age 31, new age 33, because our watcher executed since we changed age, which is our dependency here. Actually, you can also specify more than one dependency, so that you even gain more flexibility than with watch in the options API by passing an array of dependencies here. Then here you could specify age and let's say uname as a dependency, and therefore let's move watch below uname so that we do have access to it. So now either when age or this computed ref changes, when either of these two changes, this function executes. And then we actually also get different kinds of values here as arguments. We get our new values here and our old values. We now get arrays for both arguments because we have more than one dependency. So our old age now is old values and then the first element, since the age is our first dependency. And our new age is new values and then the first element. Because if you have more than one dependency, you get more than one value for these arguments, and the order of values here follows the order of your dependencies. Hence, of course, if we want to, we can also copy those console log statements and output the old name, which is old values and then the second element, and new name, which is new values and then the second element. And now with that saved, if we reload, I can change the age, and you see old age, new age, and nothing for old name and new name, because there we didn't enter anything. But if I now start typing here, maybe just one character, we see the watcher fires again, because now the age didn't change, but the name did. So you even gain more flexibility with this watch function, because now, unlike in the options API, where you always had just one dependency per watcher, you can now have multiple dependencies that trigger this watcher function. And that's how you replace watch with this watch function when using the composition API. Now that is the core of the composition API. We covered the core features in the last lectures: ref and reactive, computed, watch, and calling functions from inside the template. What's really important to me here is that you realize that the template code does not change. We still use interpolation, we could still use vbind, we still listen to events in exactly the same way we did before. We can still use vmodel. That's all the same. Other options we might have, like components or props, also would not change. It's just the logic here in setup which is new and which replaces, as you learned, data, methods, computed, and watch. Now, of course, still there are many other minor things you gotta know when working with the composition API. Some issues and problems you will eventually run into, which you gotta know how to solve when switching from the options API to the composition API. Which is why we will also apply the composition API to a bigger project to see all those special cases in action. There are a couple of special cases which I want to cover before we dive into a project though. So in the next lectures, I'll dive into some individual aspects you should be aware of when working with the composition API. Let's start with refs. And now I don't mean refs in the setup method, which are our reactive values, but I mean refs referring to elements in our template. Let's say for the last name, for whatever reason, we don't want to use vmodel. Instead here, I want to use set a ref, last name input, and I want to use the approach you saw a couple of times throughout the course, where I read the value from an input by using this $refs variable inside of some method in our config object. So let's say we want to do the same here. So we have a button here, set name, where upon a click, I want to call some setName function, and that function should then set the last name. Actually, therefore, I will name it setLastName and name the function setLastName. Now, of course, first of all, we create that function. So we add a new function in the setup method, setLastName. This function receives no arguments, but in here, I now want to set lastName value, referring to the value prop of my lastName ref here, equal to the value stored in this input. And for this, historically with the options API, we would have used this $refs and then our ref name here, which is last name input, dot value. This won't work here though, because inside of the setup method, you don't have access to this as you're used to. You won't find a $refs thing there. Instead, the approach is the other way around, you could say. Now you define your refs, including your template refs like this one, in the setup method. There is no differentiation between your own refs that manage your own data and refs you want to bind to some DOM element. So here you simply create a new ref, last name input, by calling ref. The initial value here is null because initially this is not bound to any element in the template. But now we can simply expose last name input to the template by returning it here. Maybe instead of last name, which we now don't need in the template anymore, we now expose last name input and also already the setLastName function here. So I'll expose this function as well. So now this new ref and this function is exposed. And now last name input is bound to this input here because we're using the same name here. And you still assign a ref like this, just a string with the ref name that you created in your setup function. So last name input here, once it's exposed to the template like this, is then available under that name for this special ref prop, which you can set on any DOM element of your choice. And Vue will make the connection behind the scenes. And with that, we'll be able to go to our setLastName function here and simply get the value from that input by accessing lastNameInput.value.value. Now, this might look strange, this .value thing. Keep in mind, you always get access to the value of a ref with .value. And the value of this ref will be a pointer at this input element object. And this object in turn will also have a value property holding the user input. So the second .value is getting access to that value property of the input element object. The first .value gets access to the value of our ref, which then is that input element object. With that, we get access to the user input, and we're setting our last name equal to it. And therefore, with all of that, if we save this and reload, I can enter Max here, my watcher fires, and I see Max here. But if I type here in the last name, this does not update automatically because we removed two-way binding. Instead, I can now click set last name, and it works. And it also, of course, triggers the watcher. So that's how we can work with template refs. Now, up to this point, I always just worked with my main Vue app here. Typically, of course, you have multiple components. Let's say we have a separate component for the user data here. So we could create a components folder, and in there have a userdata.vue file. And here in the template, I want to have my h2 tag with the username. And I want to have my h3 tag with my age. Now we can add a script here, and we can expect some props here, because that data should come from outside, username and age. So we could add a username and age prop here, and now simply go back to app.vue and import this user data component from /components userdata.vue and register it with the components option. And as I mentioned before, you still have this option. This does not go into the setup method. You keep your option here. So we register user data here, this new component, and we can then use it here. User data, opening and closing, and bind those props. User name and age. And I'll bind username to my username computed ref, which is exposed here in the returned object to the template, and bind age to this href, which we're also exposing. And that, therefore, all just works, as you can tell. However, maybe we want to do more in this component. Maybe here we want to use the setup method as well, because maybe we don't get the username like this, but instead we get the first name and last name separated. And we want to compute it here in the setup method. Well, first of all, let's maybe not use the setup method, but a good old computed option. So let's use the options API here. Then we could have a username computed property, since that's what I'm using here in the template, and simply return this dot first name plus blank plus this dot last name. Right? This is how we could do this in a regular component using the options API if we get two props and we want to merge it into one computed prop. Now we just need to bind first and last name. So in app view, I now bind first name and last name. And the values here should be my first name ref and my last name ref. And we now need to ensure that both are exposed to the template. The first name ref already is, but the last name ref is not anymore. So let's re-add last name to the object which we are returning in setup, so that this is available in the template. And now first name and last name are forwarded to user data. And if I save that, this just works. And this might or might not be a surprise, but there's a very important message here. You can absolutely mix the options and the composition API. App view uses the composition API, user data view uses the options API. And there's nothing wrong with it, absolutely nothing. Just because you use the composition API in one component does not mean you have to use it in all components. It's optional. You can use it wherever it makes sense to you. So it is absolutely fine to use the options API and therefore the computed option here in user data. And you see that those ref values are extracted correctly by view and forwarded as values for first and last name props. Nonetheless, even though we don't have to, let's say we want to migrate to the composition API inside of user data as well. So instead of using computed here, we import computed from the view framework like this, and we then add our setup method. Here we got our uname, let's say. Of course, this name is up to you. And we derive it by calling computed and passing a function to computed, where we now return, well, return what? We want to get access to our props here, first name and last name. In the computed option, we did it with the this keyword, but I can tell you, and I told you before, that this will not work like that. So if we try to use the this keyword and get access to our props here, this won't work. We can still give it a try. Let's return username here as an object and point at the computed uname property so that in the template username is available. And let's save this. And you'll notice that I can reload and get an error. Cannot read property first name of undefined. So trying to access first name on this fails because this is undefined at this point. Because setup basically gets called too early by view. At this point of time, the view instance object doesn't exist yet. So we don't have access to props like that. Still, of course, we do get access to props, because setup actually is a method that accepts two arguments. The first parameter we get here is the props parameter. It's an object full of the props you're getting in this component. And therefore you can simply access props.firstName and props.lastName like this. Now you can name this argument however you want, by the way. It's your method, so any name of your choice is fine, but I'll go with props and I'll stick to props throughout this course here. And with that, if we save this and reload, now it's working again, as you can tell. So the setup method receives this props argument automatically passed in by Vue. If your component gets no props, it's simply an empty object. You always get this props thing, but it can be empty if you don't have any props. Here we do have free props, and therefore they're all part of this props object. And whenever props should change from outside, this change is also propagated here to the setup method, and Computed, for example, will pick up that props changed and will recalculate its uname. As you can tell, if I type here, it updates up here, which is in that different component. So props by default are reactive, not the individual values in there, but the props object as a whole. So whenever the props object as a whole changes, which will happen whenever one of the prop changes, Vue will notice this and will rerun any code that depends on props. Now setup does not just get this props parameter, it also gets a second parameter. A second argument is always fed in by Vue, and that's the context object. We can console log context here to see what's inside of that. If I save that and reload, it looks like an empty object, but actually if we inspect it, we see three important properties in there: attrs, emit, and slots. Attrs are any fall-through attributes you might have. So if you set something like, let's say, a class here on user data, and class is not a prop you define here, then it's automatically a fall-through prop. It's an optional prop, you could say. Here, in this case, actually, if I reload, I will get a warning because this fall-through behavior doesn't really work if you have multiple root nodes. But if I wrap this in one root node here, like that, and then reload, the warning is gone. And now under attrs, if we inspect the target, we see our class here with the test value. So that's attrs. It's properties which you didn't define as properties, which just fall through. Slots would give you access to any slot data you might have in your component. This, of course, is a component without slots, but if you had a slot in there, you could access the slot data programmatically through that slot property on context. And emit is a function which you can call to emit a custom event, because of course that's also something you often need to do. And with the options API, we always used this $emit. Now, since the this keyword, as you learned, isn't available here, this $emit is not available in the setup method. Still, of course, you might have code that needs to emit. In that case, you have context emit, and that works just like this emit. So if you had a save data a custom event, for example, with some data you want to emit, the equivalent to this options API syntax would be this syntax here with context emit. We don't need it here, but it is worth being aware of that. Now I got two more features I want to cover with the composition API. The first one is provide inject. We're not using it here, but let's say instead of forwarding the age to user data through the age prop, which of course would be fine here and actually would be the recommended way, but instead of doing that, let's say we want to provide injected. So I remove the age prop from user data. I also remove it there from the props array. And now instead I want to provide and inject it. With the options API, we simply added this provide option, which could be a function in which we return our provided object, if you remember. And there we could have provided our age like this. Well, with the composition API, we have an equivalent. We can import provide from Vue. So that's another feature exposed by the Vue framework which we can import. And provide also, like all these things here which we import, is a function. And we can, for example, call it here after I initialized my UHref and provide a value by passing two arguments to provide. The first one is a key of your choice, user age, for example. The second parameter then is the actual value you want to provide. So here, this UHref. And since I'm providing a ref here, the places where I will inject it later will automatically be updated and be notified about changes to age. So that's a nice thing here. So now we provide user age like this. And now the only other thing we gotta do is we gotta go to the place where we want to inject it, in this case user data. And now we don't use the inject option here. Instead, we import the inject function from view. And then here in the setup method, I can call inject and use the same key I used for provide. So in my case, user age here. And this will give me this provided value. And I can then just store it in a constant of my choice. And what I get here will be the value I provide here. So in this case, this ref. So here, age will also be a ref. Now you should not change the age from down there. This would work, but it would be very unpredictable. As a strong recommendation, you should only change injected values in the place where you provide them. So in this case, in the app view file. But you can absolutely read the injected value, or in this case, expose it to the template. Expose age under the age key, and therefore we can use this shorthand. And now age is available in the template again, even though it's not a prop anymore. But if we save it, you see the age here, and if I click change age, it also updates correctly. So that's provide inject with the composition API. I would argue that it's even a bit easier and less code than with the options API. So that's how we can go from the options API to the composition API. Data is replaced with refs and reactive. Methods are replaced with functions, which you expose to the template by returning them in that object, which you return in setup. Computed is replaced with the computed function, and watchers are replaced with the watcher functions. Provide inject is replaced with the provide and inject functions. Now there's one more thing I want to dive into before we apply that all to a bigger project, and that are lifecycle hooks. There we have, for example, before create and created in the options API, and we could simply add those methods to our config object. How does this look like with the composition API? With the composition API, we don't add those lifecycle hooks to our component config object anymore. Instead, we have functions which we can import from view, which you can call inside of the setup method. But for before create and created, there actually is no equivalent because these hooks are not needed here because the setup method basically runs at the same time before create and created ran in the past. So setup replaces these hooks. Whatever you would have done in created or before create should be done in the setup method itself. Now for before mount and mounted, it's different. There we have the on before mount and on mounted functions which can be imported from view. For before update and updated, it's similar, and the same for before unmount and unmounted. Here we have on before unmount and on unmounted. So you see a pattern here. Let's now also have a look at that in code. Back here, let's say in the user data component, as I mentioned, we're now not going to add created and mounted and so on here to our options object. Instead, we're going to add them here in setup by importing the required hooks. Now, as I mentioned, there is no on before create and so on, but there is a on before mount, there is a on mounted, on before update, on updated, and on before unmount as well as on unmounted. And I quickly restructure this to make it easier to read. These are the lifecycle hook functions which we can import from Vue. Now, how do we use them in setup? In setup, you simply call them, like for example on before mount, like this, and you pass a function to them. And this function will now be executed whenever this lifecycle hook is due. So here I can console log before mount or on before mount, whatever you want. And we can now repeat this. We also have on mounted. So here I will print on mounted. We also have on before update. So we print on before update. We have on updated. So here we can print on updated. And we have on before unmount and print on before unmount, as well as here on unmounted. Here on unmounted and print on unmounted. And if we now saved it all and reload, we see on before mount and on mounted here. If I clear the console and click change age, we also see on before update, then our watcher runs, and then on updated thereafter, once the update was applied to the template and to the real DOM. Well, and for unmounting, we would need to get rid of user data, which we can do with an if statement, for example, with vif. If we now had some condition here that could get false, this component would be removed from the DOM, and when that happens, the on unmount hooks would be called. But I think the pattern should be clear here. We see those logs here, and we see that this is how you can register code that should be executed at different phases of the life cycle of a component. You simply call those special functions, which you import from Vue, and you pass your function that holds your to-be-executed code to those functions. And that's how you work with lifecycle hooks in the Composition API. So now, with all the knowledge about the Composition API we gained over the last lectures in this module, we can come back to this project I showed you in the second lecture of this module, where I mentioned why you could consider using the Composition API instead of the Options API. Now you find this project attached. If you install everything and start the development server, you'll see this application here. Here you can sort the users, you can filter for users. It's a very simple filter here, but it works. You can select a user to view the projects, and you can also filter those projects here if you want to. So that is the project we have here, and that's entirely built with the Options API. I strongly recommend that you maybe pause the video here and go through the project real quick so that you see how it is built, how it is made up of different components, that you see how the different pieces work together. In the end, it's not a super complex project. It's basically all about having a list of users, where every user then has a list of projects, but we got a couple of components that work together here for displaying the users, for displaying the projects, and of course also for example, adding search and so on. So take that break to analyze the project, and thereafter we'll start migrating this to the Composition API. Of course, you can also try this on your own. This might be a great practice, but if you get stuck or if you're not sure, definitely also feel free to do this together with me. Starting in the next lecture, we'll dive into this and we'll migrate this entire project from the Options API to the Composition API. Were you successful? In case you tried this on your own and you succeeded, great job. In case you faced some problems, well, that is no problem at all. We just got started with the Composition API, so it is absolutely normal that you're maybe not 100% sure about all the concepts yet. Now we'll migrate this to the composition API together. And I will start in app view. App view is a very simple component. It has a very simple template where I, in the end, just use two other components and pass data to those components. And then we got two pieces of data here, the currently selected user, when we select a user here to view the projects, and the active users, which simply are our users which we want to display. And the active users are populated with some dummy user data, which is coming from the dummy data JavaScript file. In there, I'm simply exporting a long array, and I just outsourced this into a separate file so that I don't have this long array in my app view file. Of course, that could be data which we fetch from a server. In reality, here it's just this dummy user data. So, in order to migrate this component to the composition API, in the end, we will replace the data and the methods option with the new setup option. Because that's what you learned in this module. The setup option, this setup method, is the key to using the composition API, because in there you set up your component, the data you want to be able to use in your template, and also all the functions that should be callable, and so on. And here we got two pieces of data, our active users and a selected user. So now we can make our first decision on how we want to manage that data. We could manage that data in an object, and then we can create that object either as a ref or with the reactive function, as you learned, or we manage two separate pieces of data, selected user and this user data array. It's up to you what you want to do. I will actually go for the separated data. So I will import from view, and I will import this ref function because I want to create two separate refs here. Again, this is just one approach, and if you want to manage one object with reactive maybe, that is fine as well. But I will go for this ref here, or for these two refs, and then we have the selected user here, where I create a new ref where the initial value is null, and then we have the active users, also a ref, where I pass in my user data. Now actually, by the way, user data, this doesn't need to be a ref, because in this entire component I got no logic for changing active users. And if you never change data, this probably doesn't need to be a ref, because view doesn't need to know about any changes then, if there are no changes. So actually, active users could also just be managed as regular data, like this, because it's data that never changes. So I will not even turn this into a ref here to make it clear that we don't need a ref here. Well, and then we want to expose this to our template. So we return this object in the setup method, which is a key concept. You always return an object in setup to tell view which features, you could say, which constants and variables and functions from inside the setup method should be available in the template. And here I want to expose the selected user using this JavaScript shorthand, where instead of writing this, I write this, and I expose my active users. Active users can't change, or view will not notice any changes since it isn't a ref, but of course this does not mean that we can't expose it to the template. We absolutely can. And with that, we can get rid of the data method here, and I will remove it here. You could of course also comment it out if you want to see it in comparison. Now with that, we migrated our data. Now we also want to migrate the method, because right now this method wouldn't work. We tried to work with this selected user, and this property doesn't exist anymore because I just deleted data. As a side note, theoretically, you can use data methods and setup side by side if there is some data and functionality you want to manage with the composition API and other data and functionality you want to manage with the options API. So even inside of the same component, you could mix those concepts. In reality, I would say you will typically migrate an entire component to the composition API or stick to the options API and not mix it. But theoretically, you could mix it. Anyways, here I want to migrate everything. So therefore in setup, we can define a function, maybe keep the name, select user, expect to get the user ID as an argument here, and then set selected user.value equal to, well, basically this logic. So I can copy this, except for the this keyword, and find the user with that ID in my active users and set my selected user equal to that user. And now we can also get rid of methods here and expose select user like this to the template as well, so that our event binding here, still works. And that should be all. If we save this and reload, this application works just as it does before. Because as I also mentioned throughout this module, you can absolutely combine components that use the options API, which in this case are all other components, and components that use the composition API, the app view component in this case. This is absolutely possible, and that's exactly what we're doing here. So with that, we migrated our first component. Let's now move on to the next one. Were you successful? In case you tried this on your own and you succeeded, great job. In case you faced some problems, well, that is no problem at all. We just got started with the composition API, so it is absolutely normal that you're maybe not 100% sure about all the concepts yet. Now we'll migrate this to the composition API together. And I will start in app view. App view is a very simple component. It has a very simple template where I, in the end, just use two other components and pass data to those components. And then we got two pieces of data here, the currently selected user, when we select a user here to view the projects, and the active users, which simply are our users which we want to display. And the active users are populated with some dummy user data, which is coming from the dummy data JavaScript file. In there, I'm simply exporting a long array, and I just outsourced this into a separate file so that I don't have this long array in my app view file. Of course, that could be data which we fetch from a server. In reality, here it's just this dummy user data. So, in order to migrate this component to the composition API, in the end, we will replace the data and the methods option with the new setup option. Because that's what you learned in this module. The setup option, this setup method, is the key to using the composition API, because in there you set up your component, the data you want to be able to use in your template, and also all the functions that should be callable, and so on. And here we got two pieces of data, our active users and a selected user. So now we can make our first decision on how we want to manage that data. We could manage that data in an object, and then we can create that object either as a ref or with the reactive function, as you learned, or we manage two separate pieces of data, selected user and this user data array. It's up to you what you want to do. I will actually go for the separated data. So I will import from view, and I will import this ref function, because I want to create two separate refs here. Again, this is just one approach, and if you want to manage one object with reactive maybe, that is fine as well. But I will go for this ref here, or for these two refs, and then we have the selected user here, where I create a new ref, where the initial value is null, and then we have the active users, also a ref, where I pass in my user data. Now actually, by the way, user data, this doesn't need to be a ref, because in this entire component I got no logic for changing active users. And if you never change data, this probably doesn't need to be a ref, because view doesn't need to know about any changes then, if there are no changes. So actually, active users could also just be managed as regular data, like this, because it's data that never changes. So I will not even turn this into a ref here to make it clear that we don't need a ref here. Well, and then we want to expose this to our template. So we return this object in the setup method, which is a key concept. You always return an object in setup to tell Vue which features, you could say, which constants and variables and functions from inside the setup method should be available in the template. And here I want to expose the selected user using this JavaScript shorthand, where instead of writing this, I write this, and I expose my active users. Active users can't change, or Vue will not notice any changes since it isn't a ref, but of course this does not mean that we can't expose it to the template. We absolutely can. And with that, we can get rid of the data method here, and I will remove it here. You could of course also comment it out if you want to see it in comparison. Now with that, we migrated our data. Now we also want to migrate the method, because right now this method wouldn't work. We tried to work with this selected user and this property doesn't exist anymore because I just deleted data. As a side note, theoretically, you can use data methods and setup side by side if there is some data and functionality you want to manage with the composition API and other data and functionality you want to manage with the options API. So even inside of the same component, you could mix those concepts. In reality, I would say you will typically migrate an entire component to the composition API or stick to the options API and not mix it. But theoretically, you could mix it. Anyways, here I want to migrate everything. So therefore, in setup, we can define a function, maybe keep the name, select user, expect to get the user ID as an argument here, and then set selected user.value equal to, well, basically this logic. So I can copy this, except for the this keyword, and find the user with that ID in my active users and set my selected user equal to that user. And now we can also get rid of methods here and expose select user like this to the template as well, so that our event binding here still works. And that should be all. If we save this and reload, this application works just as it does before. Because as I also mentioned throughout this module, you can absolutely combine components that use the options API, which in this case are all other components, and components that use the composition API. The app view component in this case. This is absolutely possible, and that's exactly what we're doing here. So with that, we migrated our first component. Let's now move on to the next one. So let's move on to the next component. Let's say the user item. This is a simple component. It doesn't have a lot of logic in it. Just props, a custom event, and then one method. So we could, of course, absolutely keep the options API here. And you know what? I will actually do just that. I want to make it clear that the composition API is not a must-use and that it is fine to mix and match components using different APIs in the same project. You also might have reasons for moving every component to a certain approach in an entire project. But on the other hand, you could also argue that there's nothing wrong with the options API in such a simple component. So I will leave it here, but of course be aware that migrating it to the composition API would also be fine. But with that, I'm done with users. Let's move on to UI. Here in base search, we get another simple component. And for the same reason as before, I will keep the options API approach here. But again, as I just said, you could also migrate simply to have all components using the same API in a given project. The base container doesn't even have any scripting logic. The project item.view also doesn't really have anything, just gets a title prop, so there is nothing to migrate here. And that leaves us with the project list component. Here, just as with the user list component, we get a bunch of logic, so that will be the last component I now migrate from options to composition API. So to do that, as before, let's add the setup method here, and let's start with the data. You might know this search term thing. It's basically what we did in the user list.view file, and therefore we will just repeat what we did there. I will import from view, and I will import ref here to manage two refs, and then create the entered search term ref, which is an empty string, and the active search term, which is a ref with an empty string initially. And then we can comment out data, or delete it, of course. Now for computed. There I got a has projects computed property, which basically just checks whether this user has any projects at all. And we got the available projects computed property. Now I will start with the available projects computed property. So let me use computed here, import computed, and call computed here. Store the result in the available projects constant to keep that name. And then just copy the logic from here into the function that we pass to computed, where I'm checking the active search term value. And then I want to work with props again. So we should again accept props here as an argument, as a parameter in the setup method, so that we can access props.user.projects, and then here again use active search term.value, and here again props.user.projects. And with that, I migrated the computed property to this new computed property. So let's now continue with has projects, maybe with the second computed property. I will already copy the logic and then simply create a new has projects computed property by calling computed. And in the function we pass here, I return props user projects and available projects dot value dot length now. Dot value because available projects is a computed property, therefore now a ref, and therefore we get the value by accessing dot value. And now both computed properties are migrated, and we can comment this out as well. Update search is a function we have to add, so that should be pretty straightforward. Function update search, where I simply update entered search term dot value and set it equal to val. And then last but not least, I have my watcher here, where I again will copy this logic. I got a second watcher thereafter as well, but I'll start with this first one. So copy that logic. Import watch from view, and then add the watcher, maybe here below the computed properties. Add this watcher, add this function with that watcher logic, and add entered search term as a dependency, because in the end it's the value of the entered search term we're interested in. And here I want to compare the new value to my entered search term value. So it's the same logic as in the user list component, and update the active search term value whenever that changed. And just in case you're wondering, active search term isn't a dependency here because changes in active search term shouldn't trigger this watcher. And then I got a second watcher here, this one where I basically reset the entered search term whenever we got a new user. So here I'm watching the user prop. And I'm doing this so that if I just searched here, let's say, and I switch users, I reset that and show all the projects of the newly selected user. So that's why I have this watcher, and therefore I'll copy that watcher logic and add a new watcher function here. And the watcher function holds that logic, of course, where I set entered search term.value, but now the dependency is of course not entered search term, but as before, my user prop. Now here you could do props.user, but this would not work, as you will see. But let's try this first, and then I'll explain why this won't work. And now let's comment out the watcher and save everything. And now, of course, expose with return to the template what we need in the template. Because right now we're getting an error that some things are missing or are not being used. Now in the template, we absolutely need our user, this user prop, and that will be available automatically. We don't need to expose it because props which you assign here are automatically available in the template. That logic doesn't change, so you don't need to expose props here. But we need to expose has projects, the update search function, the entered search term, the available projects. Yeah, that should be the things we need to expose. So the entered search term, available projects, has projects, and update search. And with that, I'm getting val is not defined and an unnecessary semicolon. Yeah, here in this watcher, I renamed the argument to new value, something you don't have to do, but since I did it, I should also rename it here. Reformat everything to get rid of that extra semicolon, which I have somewhere. And now this loads. But now I'm getting an error or a warning here. Invalid watch source, null. And that is coming from the watcher where I watch my user. I mentioned that this wouldn't work. The problem with drilling into props here to access the user is that we're basically drilling into a reactive object to then watch a non-reactive value. Initially, user is null because initially no user is selected. And now we're watching null, which makes no sense to view. Instead, we need to watch something reactive, a ref or a reactive object. Props is a reactive object, but just as we had it before in the module, the values inside of props are not reactive, are not refs. And therefore, we should watch props as a whole here. And if we do this and reload, now that works. Now, of course, here that's fine because we only have one prop. But if you had multiple props, and they could change, the problem you would have is that your watcher runs whenever any prop changes, not just the user prop. So if you would want to handle this, which again is not necessary here because we only have one prop, but if you would want to be sure that only changes in user trigger this watcher, you could use a feature provided by Vue. We can use the toRefs function, which we also saw earlier in this module, in this optional deep dive, reactivity deep dive lecture. We can call toRefs on props, and now we got our props with refs object, you could say. And from there, we can extract our user like this, or with a bit of a more modern, shorter syntax using object destructuring, like this. This will pull out the user key from that props object, and now, because of toRefs, that will be a ref, and it will then store this in a constant of the same name. And now we could add user as a dependency here, which now, thanks to toRefs, will be a ref. That is the alternative if you don't want to watch all props, but just one prop. It's a bit advanced, but I hope it's clear why we're doing this. With that, if I reload, this works. I can switch to different users. Searching here works. Resetting, if I switch the user, also works. And with that, overall, it looks like we're able to, well, make this app work. And it looks like we migrated this app successfully from the Options API to the Composition API. And that hopefully does not just show you why the Composition API might be better, especially for large components like user list, but it also hopefully now helps you understand how the Composition API works and how you can use it in your next projects if you want to. I just want to come back to one thing real quick. And that is this second argument for using the Composition API. I mentioned that reusing logic across components can be tricky or cumbersome and could be easier when using the Composition API. Well, this is something we're not going to have a look at in this module, but instead in the next module, which will be about reusing code and logic in general, not just with the Composition API, but also still with the Options API. Because the Composition API is just an alternative, not a must use. The basics of the Composition API should be clear now. But throughout this course, we haven't just learned about data and computed properties. We, for example, also learned about routing. And attached you find another starting project where I got a very simple application that uses routing set up for you. Now, if you load this application, this is what you got. You essentially got two main routes, all products and add product. Here you can, well, add a new product, and then you see it here. And we face a couple of problems or uncertainties here when using the Composition API. For example, when I add a new product and I click Add Product, it would be great if I would automatically be redirected to all products. In addition, when I click View Details here, I want to see the details for that product. And why is that complicated with the Composition API, at least at the moment? Because we don't know how to get that data on this route, for example, because we don't know how to navigate programmatically. Without the Composition API, we knew that there was this $router and this $route. So, for example, the product details page, it's loaded for /products and then this dynamic segment. Now, we learned in the routing module of this course that we can get the concrete value for this dynamic segment inside of the product details here with the this $route object. The problem with the Composition API is that there is no this keyword in the setup method. So how do we get our route parameters here then? Well, there are two ways of fixing this. For one, you can of course use an approach which I showed you in the routing module. You can configure this route such that the dynamic segment is passed as a prop into the to-be-loaded component, simply by adding this props option on the route config and setting it to true. Now the value for PID, product ID, will be provided as a prop in the product details component. And you know that we get props as a first argument here in the setup method. So now with that, we could then use inject to inject the products which I'm managing and providing here in app view into product details. So here we can get our products by calling inject products, injecting the provided products. And on our props, we'll get this PID prop, which holds the value of the dynamic segment in the URL. So here in product details, we can then get our selected product by reaching out to products, so the injected products, and finding the product where product.id is equal to props.pid. PID because that's the name I chose here in my route config. And then we can get the title, price, and description from that selected product. So we don't even need our refs here because I don't want to set up or change the data in here. I just want to extract it from the selected product. So we get title by selecting select product.title, and the same for the price. And of course, then also for the description, selected product.description. And now the only thing we gotta do is we have to ensure that the different product IDs are provided in the URL when we click View Details. For that, in all products where this router link is set up, this should of course not be ID as a text. Instead, 2 should be dynamically bound to a string, for example, which starts with /products, but which then includes the ID of the product we're rendering here, and we get that from product.id here, just as I'm assigning the key here on the list item. And with that, I can click on View Details, and I see nothing. A reason for that is that I got an error. Products find is not a function. We of course must not forget that products, which we inject here, is a ref here in AppView. And therefore, of course, when we want to access the concrete value in there, the array, we have to do this with the value property on products. And of course, we should also let Vue know about the props we're getting here. So add PID as a prop here. And with that, we can view the details, and this works. Now, what if we, for whatever reason, had a router link here in the details, which always leads to product 2? So where the link goes to products/P2, which is the ID of product 2. If I'm on the page of product 1 and I click this, this doesn't update. And we know this problem from earlier in the course. Now with the Options API, when we used props to get our product data, we watched our props data, our dynamic parameter value for changes. And we need to do something similar here. We could use a computed property, for example, to make selected product a computed property, a computed value. Like this. Now, of course, we then should also make sure that those other values, title, price, and description, update when we got a new selected product. And there are various ways of doing that. One way, definitely not the shortest one, but one way would be to now turn those into computed properties as well. Like that. And if we do this, we of course have to use .value here, since selected product is now a ref. It's a computed property after all. With that, if we save this, go to the first product and click product 2, now this updates. This is how we could do this with the composition API. But that was also just one way of getting our dynamic route parameter, by utilizing props. What if we wanted to use the $route object? Maybe also because we're not just interested in our route parameters, but in the query parameters or in the path. Now, as mentioned before, the this keyword does not exist here, so we can't access this $route and we can't access this $router. But we can import something from Vue router that will help us. We can import a couple of built-in hooks, also called composables. Now, what are hooks or composables? In the end, these are different terms for a special kind of function. Hooks, composables, custom composition functions. These are special functions written in JavaScript which are built for the composition API, so for being used inside of the setup method. These functions internally typically use some composition API features like refs or computed. In a separate module later about reusing functionality, you will learn how to build your own hooks, your own custom composition functions. Here, the Vue router team did this for us, and it's giving us a couple of functions, a couple of composition functions, also called hooks or composables, which you can call inside of the setup method to then get access to certain features that work together nicely with the composition API. And useRoute, for example, allows us to get access to this route object. Here, like this. If we do this, I can console log route here. And if I do that, save this and reload, and open the console, we see that is a reactive object, and therefore a proxy, with all that route data in there. And since it's reactive, we can of course watch it or use it in computed props to update any data that depends on it whenever route changes. So with that, instead of props PID, we could also use route parents PID here. That would be possible. And then of course we don't need props. So if we use that, go to the carpet, it works just as before, but now using this route object, which we get with help of the use route hook or custom composition function, also sometimes called composable, whatever you want to call it, which is provided by the View Router package. And another composable, another hook, which is also provided by View Router, can help us with the programmatic navigation in Add Product. Here, in Submit Form, in this function, I want to navigate to the All Products page as soon as a product has been added. In the Options API world, we would use this router push and then go to /products, for example. In the Composition API world, the this keyword doesn't exist and hence this doesn't work. But again, the View Router team has got us covered. From View Router, we can import use router. So not use route like before, but now use router. And we can call this anywhere in our setup method, like this, to get access to this router object. And now we can simply call router push, using that router object we create by calling that custom composition function provided by the View Router team. So if we now save that and go to Add Product, and I enter some data and click Add Product, we're navigated to the All Products page. And that is all I wanted to show here. This is how you can use the View Router in components that use the Composition API. Generally, the router works just as before. You define routes in the same way, and you can use all the features you learned about. But when it comes to dynamic parameters, possibly passed to a component as props, or when it comes to using the route or router object, this is how you can use these features, by using the custom composition functions provided by the View Router package, or by using props as I showed it to you a couple of minutes ago. Now we know how we can use routing with the Composition API. What about Vuex? How can we use that with the Composition API? For this, attached you find another very simple dummy project. We got a counter there and a button, which currently does nothing. But this is built with the Composition API. I mean, these are very simple components, but I plan on using the Composition API there. The app.view file is pretty straightforward and simple, just a couple of local components here. And then in the counter, I output the counter, but I plan on getting the counter with the Composition API. At the moment, I just have a dummy counter here, which does never change. And in the control center, I also plan on defining this function with the Composition API, but at the moment it does nothing. Now, obviously, we don't need Vuex for this simple of an application. We don't need Vuex for this demo, but I want to show you how you can utilize Vuex with the Composition API in case you're building more complex projects where you need Vuex. So, how does this work? In main.js, I already set up a store with create store, as you learned it in the Vuex module. I have a state, mutations, an action, and a getter. And how can we now utilize that store, which I'm already using in my app, in these components? Well, just as the router, the View Router, offered us a custom composition function, which we could call inside of our setup method to use routing features, just as the router did this, the Vuex package has something similar in store. So in the control center, where I in the end want to dispatch the increment action, I can import something from Vuex. And that something is the use store hook or the use store composable, the use store custom composition function, which is meant to be executed inside of the setup method. Here we can then call use store, and what we get as a result is access to the Vuex store, which we have attached to this application. So the Vuex store we are using with use here on our app. We get access to that store by calling use store instead of setup. Well, and once we got access, it'll of course be simple. We can just use store dispatch and then dispatch the action. So dispatch any action, like in this case the increment action, which we registered on this store. And you can then use any Vuex feature you learn about. Modules, namespacing, all of that is available. And you just use store to get access to the store instead of using this $sign store, which you would use if you would be working with the Options API. Well, and therefore it's the same here in the counter where I want to get access to some data stored in the store. I can simply import use store from Vuex, then get access to the store by calling use store, and thereafter, when we want to get a counter that depends on a getter in the store, we just need to create a computed variable, a computed value, just as we do it in the Options API world. So therefore we import computed from view, and then counter should be a computed value by calling computed, where we provide a function that will be executed whenever one of its dependencies changed. And here in this function, we return store.getters.counter, because counter is the getter name I defined here. And whenever the counter changes, Vue will detect this in the end and recalculate this computed value, which we then expose to the template. And since you learned that computed values are refs, whenever the counter does change, Vue will notice this and it will update the template in the place where we use the counter. With that, we can save that. And now if I reload, you see this works. And that's how easy it is to use Vuex with the Composition API. Now that's it for this very thorough introduction to the Composition API. We're going to see more of it throughout the rest of the course, but with this module you should have a first thorough idea of what the Composition API is about. Well, and what is it about and why do we have it? First of all, as I emphasized many times throughout the module, it's an alternative to the Options API. You don't have to use it if you don't like it or if it just doesn't make sense for your project, but you can use it, and then you will use the setup method, which you saw, to expose logic and data to the template. And the idea behind the Composition API is that it's function-based. You have all those functions you import from Vue, like ref, reactive, computed, and so on, all used in that setup method, and that this allows you to keep code that is related logically together in one place instead of splitting it across multiple options. Data and reactivity, of course, is an important concept in Vue in general, and of course therefore also in the Composition API. And here we can manage data as refs, so as individual values or an object which is in a ref, or we use the reactive function to create reactive objects. I talked about the differences and how to work with these values in great depth throughout this module. Reactivity is a key concept, and one of the most important takeaways really is that you can create reactive refs or objects, but that their nested properties are not necessarily reactive, as I also emphasized throughout this module. Now, data and reactivity is a key concept, but of course not everything. We also have methods, computed, and watchers when using the Options API, and in the Composition API, methods become regular functions which you define in the setup method, and which you then may expose to the template by returning it in that object which you return in the setup method. And then you also have computed properties and watchers, which are defined with these imported functions which you import from the Vue framework. And now if we have a closer look at this setup function or setup method, which we define in our component config object, this setup function or this setup method is called by Vue when the component is created. And in there you define all the data and logic for this component and, most importantly, for the template. So what you return in setup is available in the template, as you learned. And setup itself also receives two arguments which are passed in automatically by Vue when it calls setup for you. And that is the reactive props object with all the props you're getting for this component, and this context object with the fall through props, those attributes, with slot data, and with this emit function, which you can use for emitting a custom event.